Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, the show for software engineering leaders. I'm Arin, your host, and today I'm speaking with executive coach Lisa Rogoff about navigating change. As leaders, we face a unique challenge when guiding our teams through change. Whether it's from a reorg, new leadership, new technologies, or just fresh ideas, change impacts everyone differently, bringing both obstacles and opportunities. In addition to helping our company thrive amidst change, it's also our responsibility as leaders to help our teams navigate this uncertainty, grow through the process, and find new ways to thrive as individuals and contributors to our organizations. Lisa brings valuable insights and strategies to help us lead through these complexities. So let's dive into the conversation.
Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, where we help you manage your growing engineering team. Through expert interviews, we help you navigate the challenges of leading, hiring, growing, and nurturing your tech team to deliver the value your customers demand. Brought to you by agilityfeet.com, experts in staffing engineering teams in Latin America for clients globally.
Lisa Rogoff, founder of Launch Project, is a certified executive coach, consultant, and facilitator with over 20 years of experience helping leaders navigate change, build alignment, and foster thriving cultures. She emphasizes self-awareness, trust, and intentionality, guided by her values like candor, presence, and zest. Her work spans tech companies, nonprofits, and global organizations. You can learn more about her work at yourlaunchproject.com. For today's episode, we'll talk about how engineering leaders can navigate change and manage complexity. Welcome to the Scaling Tech Podcast, and thanks for joining me today, Lisa.
Thanks, Arin. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to share your expertise with our listeners. Navigating change, managing complexity, certainly incredibly important topics and things I think a lot of times us as engineering leaders don't necessarily have training in. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation, and I appreciate it. So from your experience, I'd like to start with kind of hearing, what do you think is the biggest mistake leaders make during times of change, and how does it ripple through an organization in ways they don't anticipate?
Well, change can feel really overwhelming. I know I feel that way. It can be really scary. It can produce lots of anxiety for individuals across an organization. So I think it's really easy and natural for leaders to go into that emergency fix it mode, calm everyone down mode, really natural first reaction. And I think that it comes from a really good place. The challenge is that when leaders do this, when they immediately leap to calm, to fix, they often haven't taken the time or the space to regulate themselves. And I found that regardless of the type of change or the type of complexity, the most important thing a leader can do is to self-regulate. And so by self-regulate, I mean taking a true pause to ground themselves in the present moment, to regulate your breathing, to ensure that your own nervous system is prepared to stay grounded despite whatever stress you're facing. And I've seen leaders with the best of intentions rush in to help their team before doing that, before regulating, and it does more harm than good. Their frantic rush kind of has the opposite effect of what they intend, because their team takes on that stress and that dysregulation. The other thing that tends to happen during turbulent times of change is that leaders get asked questions that they aren't prepared to answer. Or maybe something else happens that they weren't expecting. And if you're dysregulated, you get more dysregulated. And that often looks like defensiveness or oversharing or scaling back on transparency. Whereas if you are grounded, if you are regulated, you remember to pause. You remember to take the time to respond rather than to react. So I really do think that the biggest mistake that leaders make in moments of change is that they don't pause, they don't regulate themselves. And then their lack of clarity, their stress, their reactivity flows through the organization.
That's really interesting. So when we talk about taking a pause, I guess the scenario I'm imagining as you describe that is like top executives or the board of directors have said, this change has to happen, and the leader needs to take a little bit of time themselves to self-regulate on that before they go and talk to their team about. Is that kind of the? I mean, you're generally not going to hear the bad news right in front of your team. So you've got some time, right? And that's kind of where you're talking about taking a pause and reflecting a bit before communicating anything to your team.
Yeah, I think it can happen there. It can also be sort of a way that you live your life. So I think sometimes, to your point, like you get that information and have the time and the space to go and breathe, or maybe go for a run, or whatever it is that you use to self-regulate. And sometimes you don't get that space. And so as a leader, I think you have a real responsibility to make sure that you're constantly regulating yourself. And as humans, we get dysregulated all the time. And so part of our job is to locate where we are, to know, okay, I'm super regulated, I'm grounded, I'm ready, or I'm not. And instead of blaming yourself for not being ready, to be able to say, that's where I am. Great. What do I need to do? One of the things I often suggest to leaders is to take a sip of water and use it as a moment to just ground yourself again, because sometimes that's all we get.
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely going through my head and imagining how many times I've been self-regulated or dysregulated. So I'm interested to learn more about this from you for sure. Uh, but before we dive into that in more detail, I'd like for you to share more about your background with our listeners and how you got into executive coaching and the types of clients and situations that you work in.
Like a lot of the leaders and the clients that I work with, my career path was definitely not a direct line from point A to point B, but the through line has always been coaching. So I became an executive coach about 10 years ago. But before that, I led product management and product marketing in an ed tech company. And Arin, that's where you and
Yep.
I first met. And I found that while I really loved that work, it was the leading and the coaching of my team where I felt most passionate and most alive, most effective. Before doing that, I did human rights work, so very different space. And I spent a lot of time doing policy and advocacy work focused on inspiring college students to action to speak out against human rights abuses that were taking place in Sudan and the Congo. Definitely not executive coaching, but a lot of the same principles that apply today in my work. So listening, accountability, influence. And even as I think today about my personal life, whether it was, in college, I was a coxswain. And so I was sort of driving a rowing team. Today, I have two kids. So I think, the way I parent is very much with a coach approach. That's where I feel most comfortable. And so it's always kind of just felt like a natural bridge to me. And so I went and got trained as a coach. And that's where I learned a lot about what coaching is and what coaching can be.
No, that's great. And I think I'd love to hear you kind of explain a little bit more what a coach is, because I think too, as you know, and you said something earlier that definitely catches my, kind of engineering management mindset of diving in and trying to fix it, right? Because as engineering leaders, that's generally our mindset. That's what we want to do, and that's kind of what we get excited about, is seeing a problem and fixing it. Um, as you already said, if we don't self-regulate before that, that's no good. But also, there is a difference between being like a coach and a consultant, or being a coach and a teacher of something, and sometimes as leaders we have to swap between those different hats. So, because I think the coaching one doesn't necessarily come naturally to a fix it mindset of an engineering leader. Tell us a little bit more about what coaching is versus more instructive leadership styles, let's say.
Yeah, I don't think that is just for engineering folks. I really think most humans love to fix. I love to fix. It feeds our ego. It's fun. So I do think coaching is a skill, a practice, a way of not just leading but living, that I think can be really meaningful. But it's a muscle that you have to build. And I often talk to people who are looking for a coach to give them advice or tell them how to navigate a difficult situation. That's not coaching. That's telling someone what to do. So coaching is really about partnering with someone to help them drive toward their potential. And it's about helping them amplify their strengths, to see and navigate blind spots, and to hold them accountable for what's possible. And I think what I really have grown to love about coaching is that it's about helping other people build the confidence, gain the tools, create their own resourcefulness to tackle both the problem in front of them. So, like whether it's a challenge with their team, or to think more broadly about how do I apply these same principles beyond just my team today and think about my career long term, to think about my life, my relationships in my life long term. So I think that there's a lot of room there to grow that definition if we can tame sort of that natural desire to fix and mold other people.
Right. And I think part of where the drive for me anyways of when I'm in fix it mode is that, when I see a problem, I want to fix it as soon as possible, right? I want to dive right into it. And so that fights against the advice you just gave of taking time to pause, to self-regulate before going into that. And I mean, you mentioned in your background, doing work around human rights challenges and things that are of a much more grave nature than most of the problems that we're dealing with in the workplace, right? And so for you, I imagine that gives you a unique perspective of, okay, this is bad news, but we're going to get through it. Uh, you know, Not everyone has that perspective. How do you? Is there? I don't know. Is there a way that you mentioned taking a sip of water, I think, right? What sort of things can someone do to kind of help remind them in that moment of stress to take a pause and self-regulate a little bit?
Honestly, what I'd probably recommend is that you don't wait until that moment, but that you build a practice. I remember many years ago, someone told me that I should meditate. I had two really little kids at the time. I was running that team that I mentioned before. I had no time, and I thought it was quite out of touch for someone to tell me to meditate. Today I meditate, I love it, but I had to find that on my own. And I think that it's a really personal thing to find your practices to what helps you regulate. So I can tell you what I do. I'm happy to share that. And I would also say, find your own way and practice it and do it before you need to have it to rely on. So for me, I wake up every morning. I do not look at my phone. I immediately take a seat, take a breath. I journal, I meditate, and I work out all before I look at a screen. And for me, that's been a practice, like something I have to actively think about, not reaching for my phone, but it's been really meaningful. And it's allowed me in those moments where stress is high, where I feel dysregulated, to come back to my breath. So I think my advice would be build the practice before you need it. And then in those moments, I think it's a lot easier to use the sip of water to calm yourself down. Like one other thing I've heard and I've used at times is just to take a moment and like actually rub your fingers together and feel what that feels like. So it's just almost like a practice of like, how do you come back to this moment, not what happened 20 seconds ago or what you're worried about in the future, but how do you come back to this present moment?
Yeah, you obviously have a very disciplined morning practice, which I'm sure comes from your background in rowing crew. I know from my wife who used to row crew in college, and my oldest son who rowed crew that that's definitely an early morning disciplined sport. But also I think something that is all about a very like consistent kind of mindset, right? You're doing something early in the day, usually in a beautiful setting out on the water, but it's about a consistent, disciplined mindset. And so whatever that practice is, meditation, yoga, rowing, whatever the case may be, right? Finding that it's unique to each person. Yeah, like, you mentioned this taking a sip of water, I think is a great one. One that someone told me once that I've always maintained is just curling my toes in my shoes, just as a sense of like feeling a little bit grounded, reminding myself if I'm drifting in a conversation or losing focus in something, to just do that as a way to recenter myself. And it's a funny little practice that everybody has their own, can find their own, but can make a big difference in a moment of stress, I think. So are there key principles that leaders should follow when navigating their teams through a complex change?
I think there's so many different frameworks and ways to think about this. For me, I really love the work of Jennifer Garvey Berger. She is a researcher and she's a writer and she studied adult development. She's also done a lot of work on complexity and change. She actually has a beautiful book that I recommend to leaders all of the time because she is a researcher, so she writes these really long, wonky books, but she wrote one specifically for leaders. It's like 100 pages or so. It's called Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps. And she identifies 5 mind traps or sort of ways of thinking that tend to hinder leaders during complexity. And with those mind traps, she also offers solutions for each of them. And I think that that's been super powerful, both for me and for the people that I work with. So happy to share a few of those if that would be helpful.
Please.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll just give them at a very high level. So first is simple stories. So as humans, we're storytellers, but often those stories oversimplify the world and they lead us to believe that we are the hero of our own story. The second one, yeah, I see you laughing there. Familiar.
Resonates.
Yeah. The second one is rightness. This is like when we are so certain that our perspective is the right perspective. And so as a result, we kind of close off any other viewpoints, which limits our ability to adapt, to learn from others around us. The third one, if there are any people pleasers listening into this, is agreement. And so we want everyone to agree. We want consensus. And during times of complexity, we often can't please everyone, and we shouldn't. And so we also can't be afraid of conflict because that's where ideas and innovation tend to come from. The fourth one is control. So if you are human, chances are that you like to be in control. And the problem is we're never really in control. And so the more you try to control what's uncontrollable, the more frustrated you get, the less effective you are. And the last one, I think is the most tricky and the most uncomfortable, and that's ego. And so the biggest challenge to change is often our own ego, our sense of self, because change can make us feel like we're losing a part of ourselves. And usually it's a part of ourselves that we've worked really hard to build. So all 5 of those mind traps tend to get us into a lot of trouble. And what I love that she does, Jennifer Garvey-Berger, is that she offers different questions you can ask yourself to try to unleash yourself from the mind trap. Would it be helpful if I shared those?
Yes, please. That'd be great.
So going back to our simple stories, this is the idea that you are the hero of your own story. The key question she suggests is, how is this other person a hero? Which really forces you to think outside of, I'm the one who's right. So it kind of ties into the rightness idea. A few years ago, I was working with a VP of engineering, and the company got bought. It changed hands. A new CEO came into place, and he started out super excited about the change. He was hungry for the innovation. He really didn't love the last CEO, but he also got really frustrated when things didn't change quickly. And he was really quick to blame the new CEO, discount his leadership, and sort of make himself the hero of the situation. And so asking the question of but how is that CEO actually the hero, forced him reluctantly to carry a few different stories about what was going on. So that's simple stories. The second one about rightness. I love this question. It's a question I have to ask myself all the time, which is, how might I be wrong? You were so sure that this perspective is the right perspective, but how might I be wrong? Forces you to really rethink how you're seeing something. For the third one, the mind trap of agreement. We often, we don't like conflict. Most humans don't like conflict. And so part of what we want to do is to be thinking about how could this conflict actually serve to deepen our relationships? How can this disagreement create generative tension?
I think that's, seeing conflict as an opportunity for growth in the relationship is I guess as someone who maybe avoids that, that's a very compelling perspective on it. I like it.
Yeah. And I think it's a perspective you can build among your team too.
Mm-hmm.
Not just hold as the leader, but really encourage your whole team to begin to see conflict as generative. Okay. The fourth mind trap was control. And this one, we really like to control. We really like to have our hands on the steering wheel. And often during change, we can have our hands there, but the wheel's going to be moving all over the place. And so instead we ask the question, what can I influence versus what can I control? And that allows us to kind of point toward a direction and begin to steer, but also to run some experiments along the way. And then for the ego one, this is another great question that I ask in lots of different situations, but I love to ask leaders, who am I becoming? And how can this change serve who I'm becoming? So there's both who you are today and who you're transforming into. And I think that can be a really valuable question to begin to think about, how can I leverage this change to serve who I'm becoming? So that was a long answer to a short question, but I think maybe sort of overall is like get to know these principles and think about how you can release their hold on you, figure out which ones have the strongest hold on you, and then, work to really be conscious of them and let them go.
Yeah, no, I really like that, and I like also because I think that for a while in the startup world, especially, I think it was trendy to talk about failing fast, and there was an emphasis on learning from failure, which is definitely a healthy thing. The maybe went a little too far with like the time where like Facebook was like move fast and break things, and then they broke a lot of things, right? So you could take that concept too far, but the idea of learning from our failures is certainly a powerful and important one, and seeing those as growth opportunities. And so that last one also really resonated with me about how does this help with who I'm becoming? What can I learn from this? What can my team learn from this? And how does that help us to reach where we want to be, even though this may be a negative situation that we're dealing with, for instance. I want to take a moment to tell you about our sponsor, WebRTC Ventures. At WebRTC Ventures, our teams are experts in building live video into your web or mobile applications. We've literally built hundreds of them. We have over a decade of experience using both open source and commercial media servers in a wide range of industries, including telehealth, edtech, broadcasting, and more. We also publish a lot of helpful tips and industry interviews on our website and our YouTube channel. So be sure to check out webrtc.ventures, and we can help you build, scale, and deploy your video solution. You made a comment earlier, too, when you were talking about self-regulation, where I believe you said that when someone is being dysregulated, they may, you listed a few sort of negative practices that they may do, and one of them was oversharing, which caught my ear because I think that is probably one that applies to me. And I think so I wanted to kind of bring up a scenario of when you have a sensitive transition, and as a leader, we have a responsibility to kind of communicate those changes to our team, in a way that is reflective of kind of the company position, I guess, but also we need to still, I guess we're, or at least we'll have a desire, I guess, this is part of my question, I suppose, of how much we reflect our own values or opinions in that, right? Like, how do you balance transparency of what maybe the company's doing, transparency of your own feelings around that, with discretion during a sensitive transition, right? And without going into all the details, I mean, I have a very specific example in my own experience in mind where, as a young leader, the first time that I was told by senior management that I had to let people go from my team, and I had to communicate that message. And that was obviously a really hard thing to do. And especially not having done that before. And to make matters worse, in that situation, I completely disagreed with the decision. Not necessarily that changes needed to be made, because it's hard to argue with numbers in a situation like that. But I definitely disagreed with some ground rules I was given of who was untouchable, and who could be laid off. And so I felt very divided by that, and how much could I share with my team, and saying, I have bad news. And I know the question you're going to ask, why is it you and not this person? And I can't answer that. Right.
Mm,
So you've got a situation there where you want to be transparent. You want to be true to your own values. You want to be kind and thoughtful, but you also need to show discretion. And, so anyways, it's a long question because I think those can be complicated scenarios, right? So how do you
yeah.
balance that oversharing, as I just demonstrated, with discretion?
Yeah. I do think that this is one of the biggest leaders or challenges leaders face when they're dealing with change and complexity, and just like in your example, like it's people, it's people's lives. It's really, really tough. I think it's also a great opportunity to create trust and create safety. And so you pointed towards so many of the things that I would say. But when I think about this question of like, how do you balance both wanting to give as much information as possible with like recognizing the limitations of oversharing, and also just like what you can and can't share, particularly when it comes to people being parting ways with people. So I often offer sort of three different principles. The first one you named, which is start with your values. So ask, I always ask leaders, like, what's most important to you? What are the values that you want to honor through this change? And what are you willing to put a stake in the ground on? So, for example, if you have a value around integrity, chances are that you're not going to lie to your employees, right? And you're going to be really clear about what you can and you can't share. For me, I have a value around being seen and seeing other people. And so I'm not going to let someone go via email. I'm going to sit down with them. I'm going to spend the time with them. I'm going to help them feel really seen through that process. So that's the first one, starting with your values. The second one you also hit on, which is sharing transparently, but really thoughtfully. And I often think of this as starting with why. And so asking, why am I sharing this information, or why am I not sharing this information, and letting people know that why. I think to your point, like oversharing for the sake of transparency can create more stress than you intend. So I often encourage leaders to be really clear with themselves and with their teams about, upfront about what I can share, what I can't share. If possible, when you'll be able to share more information. Sometimes you know that, sometimes you don't. The other piece here that I think is really tricky is that you probably know to be tailoring this to your audience. So you're going to tell your ICs that are new hires something different than you're going to tell your more senior, more tenured managers. But I think the challenge here that you really have to hold is that whatever you tell anyone has the potential to make its way throughout the organization. And so I think you have to be prepared for that. And just remember that whatever is said could make its way through the organization and outside the organization. So being really thoughtful of that. And then the third thing I would just say is use it as an opportunity to foster trust through empathy and through feedback. So let people know that having concerns, having emotions during this time of change is really normal. I think whether, in your case, Arin, like if someone is being let go, there's obviously emotions involved for that person, but there's also an emotional piece for everyone who wasn't let go and watching their colleagues have to leave the organization. So creating the space for people to bring those concerns to you and offer avenues for feedback, I think is really important and can serve in the long run.
So far, at least in the way I've been kind of framing my questions, I've been talking about change as maybe always a negative situation, which it certainly does not have to be, but also always as kind of like a top-down driven scenario. And even if it is driven from the top, there still is often an opportunity for conversation and feedback in both directions, right? So I guess I'd like to hear a little bit from you about two-way feedback during organizational change, and how how can a leader encourage open dialogue in their reluctant teams, whether it's a positive or negative situation.
I love this topic. I love the topic of feedback in general, because I just think there's so much growth that happens through giving and receiving feedback. For me personally, I feel that way. It's always a growth opportunity. So when I think about feedback, I think two-way feedback is critical. I think it's critical in times of change. I also think it's critical outside of times of change. And this seems to be a theme we keep hitting upon, which is like, you don't want to wait for things to get difficult or to have a lot of turbulence to begin to set yourself up. So I think, maybe the first piece is like, how do you create a culture of feedback in general, not just during times of change? But I think it becomes even more critical during those times of change. And I think when you have two-way feedback, it can build a lot of trust. It can build a lot of transparency. It can help you as a leader identify hidden issues. And I think it supports everyone in understanding the various perspectives that are there versus like just kind of letting those perspectives simmer under the surface. And going back to our mind trap conversation, I think it really helps with that simple stories mind trap. I do think people are hesitant to give feedback in general, and in particular during times of change, because they're often operating from a place of fear. So a few tips that might be helpful. The first one is just to name it, right? Like take the elephant out of the room and just name, like, this is really hard. It's hard to give feedback. It's hard to talk about these things. I think when you just put it out there, that can really help. Related, I think modeling vulnerability is key. So if a leader asks for feedback but hasn't, given it themselves, it just doesn't work. It lands. It just doesn't land with the team. So I think the leader needs to go first in sharing their fears, their uncertainties, and that will encourage other people to share more openly. Again, I think just build the muscle. So like making feedback a habit is really important. I really do think of it as going to the gym. It's very uncomfortable at first. As you build the muscle, it gets easier. And then I think being really specific in the feedback that will be helpful. So I often work with leaders who say things like, I asked for feedback, but I can never get it. And I'm like, what are you asking? Well, I asked for feedback. I said, what feedback do you have for me? That's a really hard way to receive feedback. It's a hard question to elicit much. And so I think the key here is, how do you ask a more specific question that will open people's feelings about what's going on, that will allow them to tap into what they really want to share with you. So questions like, what's one thing that's keeping you up at night? Or what's one thing I could do to better support you? People can usually find the one thing. And then I think the other thing is to keep going. So if you are getting the I don't know, that's great. Just say yeah, sometimes feedback is hard. I'll ask you again tomorrow, and then follow up. So those are a few tips.
Oh, thank you. And I know one area that you do a lot of work with as well are offsites. And so I'd love to hear a little perspective from you on how offsites help leaders and teams to kind of navigate these change before, as you said, kind of building the muscle before the changes, are even happening, let's say.
I do believe that offsites are a really, really powerful tool to help leaders and teams navigate in uncertain times or times of change. Again, I feel like I'm kind of beating the same drum, but I do think it all goes back to regulation. So when you're working in the business and things are changing all of the time and you don't have the answers you want and everything is moving really fast, it's dysregulating, and your nervous system and your team's nervous system is on high alert. I do think when done well, offsites can be almost like a warm bath for the nervous system. They're a way to take the foot off the gas, to stop working in the business, to create the time and the space to work on the business. They're also a chance to really reconnect to one another and to the team's purpose. And so that in and of itself is a regulation technique. And I do think there are some best practices that help create really effective offsites. So the first one is just to prime the pump. And what I mean by that is to prepare people really thoughtfully. If your team has not gone to an offsite before, they have no idea what to expect. And that can be dysregulating. So one of the things you can do is just help them get prepared to come into the offsite to make the most of it. So often I'll say give pre-work that allows them to get into the right headspace and that makes the best use of the time together. Make them feel special. So pick a special place, not the office conference room, but somewhere, doesn't have to break the budget, but somewhere where it says this is a different space. This is a different way of being together. Offer them guidelines about how to be in the space and really lead them into the offsite. So that's sort of this idea of priming the pump before they even get there. The second thing I always recommend is to design with the end in mind. So instead of creating a list of everything you want to accomplish in the offsite, I ask leaders to almost close their eyes and to imagine leaving the offsite. So I was just working with some leaders that were doing they're based in New York, their offsite's in Miami. I said, imagine getting on the plane. Imagine getting on the plane and feeling wow, that offsite exceeded our wildest expectations. What happened? What was that like? What did we create together? And then design backwards from there versus we have to get all these things done, which points to my third thing. Every time I work with leaders to create an offsite, they have a ton of things they want to do. First, we're going to do this. The agenda is packed. And so what I always say is connection over content. Don't try to shove everything in. It will be meaningless. Pick a few things and remember that the point here is connection, and that comes from creating spaciousness for people to do that, to build relationships, to have conversations with each other. And the last thing I'll say is to integrate the outcomes. I can't tell you, Arin, I'm sure how many times you've heard this is oh, we did one of those offsites, but it was great, but nothing came out of it. And so get really clear before you go into the offsite about how you're going to capture next steps, how you're going to move anything that comes out of it, anything you learn into action. And I think that really allows people to be in the offsite if they know that you're holding that for them, and to know that the offsite will be a good use of time. So highly, highly recommend being really thoughtful in that approach. And one of the things that I don't know if your audience would be interested in, but I have a free ebook specifically on this topic. It's something I'm very passionate about, which is how to design an offsite that's effective and to build an operating rhythm that allows you to keep investing in those offsites.
Perfect. No, I'm sure that we'll be interested, and so that would be available at yourlaunchproject.com.
Yes.
That ebook on it. Perfect. You mentioned pre-work for it for the offsite, and I'm curious if, in an offsite you might be working on things that are like working on the business, as you said. Other things may be working on the team, so to speak. Not necessarily outcome driven, more about building culture or open communication, that sort of thing. Is the pre-work that you do, would you recommend giving the team things that are more towards one of those over the other, of something that's more like, questions about like, what should we be working on in our technical deployment process, let's say, some sort of operational thing? Or is it like, is it softer questions about that are more culture driven, or, which approach are you taking in the pre-work?
Question. I think it really goes back to that second principle of designing with the end in mind. So if what you're hoping when you get back on that plane to have accomplished is to have finalized a process with the team and make sure that like you have everything you need to know so that when they get back into the business, that's what they can use to drive forward. That's going to be different than like, hey, I'm noticing that we've kind of slipped into this culture of everyone in their own domain. No one's talking to each other. And the purpose of our offsite is about communication. So I think it really does depend on what is the purpose, what is the why of the offsite. Often it's both, right? It's like, hey, we need a new process. And the way to like really make this process work is that people talk to each other. And so then the pre-work might be a little bit of both. Like one thing I often have teams do is create sort of a working with me document. So we'll come up with a few different questions and have people spend some pre-work thinking about like, here's what brings out the best in me. Here's what triggers me. Here are the values. Here's what you can expect of me. And then being able to have that pre-work done allows those conversations to unfold in the offsite a little bit more thoughtfully. It also lets people know like, oh, that's what we're going to be talking about when we're together.
Right.
And then if we're going to do some process mapping, having some of the nitty gritty done ahead of time will allow you to spend more time on the higher level pieces of that.
So we've talked quite a bit about, I would say more like, for the engineering leader, about self-regulating themselves and communicating down to the team. As we wrap up, I want to touch on the other direction. And so, especially, one example of a change may be new executives coming into the organization. So the engineering manager, themselves perhaps has a new boss as part of this, right? So what can they do to support leadership transitions above them, as well as kind of helping the organization and their own teams through that? What should they be doing to manage upwards?
New executives definitely create a lot of uncertainty in an organizational system. I'm just even thinking I was working with a company that got a new head of sales recently. Before she even arrived on the scene, I was hearing all of these grumblings of how this person was going to move this other person's cheese. So I definitely think this is a place of a lot of tension and fear, just sort of the topic itself, regardless of the person that's coming in. And I think it brings us back to our mind traps again. I feel like, it all comes back here. But what are the simple stories that we're telling ourselves about this new executive? So if I'm the engineering leader, what is the simple story that I'm holding? What's the simple story that my team's holding? And then I might ask some of those questions I mentioned before. How might I be wrong? What can I influence? I think as the leader, you don't want to say, it's all going to be great, but really coach the team to begin to think more openly, more expansively, more curiously. The word? I think so. Curious. Be more curious.
We'll accept it.
Yeah. And then I think as the leader, you also have an opportunity to serve as the bridge. You get to be the bridge between the new executive and the team and get really curious about how this executive can support your team and how your team can help that new executive come into the business. And I think really inviting the team to bring some of those ideas to the table, and then inviting the executive to a team meeting and coach your team to be really curious, ask questions, and bring that expansive mindset into the relationship.
Yeah, I think that the mind trap you described of how we all want to be the heroes of our own stories, and when we tell the stories, we usually are the heroes of our stories, right? And this is a negative way of reflecting that aspect of our egos when a new executive comes in is trying to show that I'm the best engineering manager in the organization. My team is the best team in the organization. Things like that sort of build me up, or maybe I'm thinking less selfishly, and it's building my team up in the organization. But nonetheless, right? It's more about showing them how awesome we are. And I guess if you're trying to think, well, how are they the hero in this story, this new executive, then you're changing your mindset a little bit to like, how do I enable them to be successful in their goals? How do I be curious about what those goals are? How do I relate that to the agenda that I may have, but still kind of trying to get that, if I and there's some balance there, right? And I guess I'm curious to hear, how do you don't want to just kind of be a yes person, right? Or you still need to speak truth to power, so to speak, but also support them in their goals. So, I guess how do you strike that sort of balance too as you manage up the balance between supporting them in their goals and self promotion of your own agenda?
We've all had experiences with leaders that have done a lot of self promotion and sort of protecting of themselves, protecting of their teams. And we can
Kingdom
feel that.
building.
Yeah. And then I hope we've all had experiences of the opposite, of leaders who are very selfless and who do care about their team and protect their team, but don't see that as like the only part of the organization. And I think that like that type of team is a lot easier to work with and people respect a lot more. And so I think it is a balance. I think we tend to err on the side, particularly when we're leaders or leading a team, we tend to err on the side of protecting our team. And so, I always think of like a pendulum, which is you don't want to swing it the other way to your point of having no boundaries and like, throwing your team under the bus or letting them kind of having to navigate something without any support. But I do think like, where is the pendulum? How can you find that middle ground, recognizing that most of us tend to swing the other way towards putting our team up on the pedestal? Um, and so I think part of it is just how do I think of myself as a partner, regardless of what area of the business I'm in.
Well, Lisa, I really appreciate the time that you've taken to speak with us, and a lot of great experience shared here. And are there any closing thoughts that you want to share with our listeners, and how can they learn more or get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, first of all, this has been so fun. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. It's been really a fun thing to talk about. I think maybe in closing, what I'd say is that we've been talking a lot about change and complexity. And I think it's such an important topic because it's not going away. Our world is just getting more complex. I don't know if you've heard the term VUCA.
No, tell me.
It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Okay.
That came from the military, but it's kind of been brought into the business world. That's not enough anymore. Now we have a new acronym to stand for sort of the complexity that we're in now, which is called BANI, BANI, brittle,
Okay.
anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And so I can go into a lot of detail on that. I won't. That's probably a different podcast. But I share it because I think it highlights that leaders today really require new tools and new mindsets to adapt effectively to the complexity that we are continuing to face. And so maybe to even just go back to where we started with the idea of self-regulation, I don't think that leaders can handle the complexity outside of themselves until we are able to notice and to empathize and to manage what complexity does inside of us. So I think maybe in closing, what I would do is just invite leaders to not just focus on the outer game of leadership. I often hear like the hard skills versus the soft skills, right? The outer game of leadership being the frameworks, the skills, the tools, but to really invest in developing the inner game of leadership, to the ability to regulate, to tune into your emotional landscape, to not just react to what's in front of you, but to know and to lead with your core values. and ultimately remember that it's the inner game that runs the outer game.
Thank you very much for that wisdom, Lisa. I appreciate it. And to remind our listeners one more time where they can learn more about you and your work.
Yeah. Well, I am on LinkedIn, so love to share ideas and thoughts there and be in conversation with people on LinkedIn. So I'd love to connect with your listeners there. We've referenced my website a few times, yourlaunchproject.com. And I have that free ebook for offsites there. Just feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk about this topic and many others with your listeners. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Really appreciate you inviting me and all your wonderful questions, Arin.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. It's been my pleasure. And we'll be sure to include those links, including your LinkedIn, on the show notes at scalingtechpod.com. So be sure to check that out to learn more about Lisa's work. And once again, thank you so much, Lisa, for joining me on the Scaling Tech Podcast.
Thank you.
On behalf of the thousands of developers we've placed with our clients, I want to briefly tell you about our sponsor, Agility Feed. Agility Feed has been building nearshore agile teams for U.S. companies since 2010. We were an early pioneer in doing this sort of developer staffing. Our team can help you recruit talented software engineers and technical teams in Latin America. We'll handle all aspects of recruiting, contracting, and payments for you so you can focus on delivering great software. To learn more, check us out at agilityfeed.com. That's agilityfeat.com.